8.2 Through absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. 8.2.1 God's principle of creation and absolute faith and absolute obedience. After creating Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, God gave them the one and only commandment and told them not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He told them to keep it from the position of one having absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, but they failed to do so. When God gave them that commandment, He Himself stood in a position of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Thus, His counterparts also had to do the same in order to achieve oneness. However, they failed to accomplish this. In the last days, in order for fallen human beings to return to the original world and to enter the kingdom of heaven, they should go through the gate of the true parents. In order to do so, they must perform acts of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, which were not carried out in the Garden of Eden. Otherwise, they cannot go to this new world. They must hold fast to the coattails of the true parents and follow them, without ever losing them, with an attitude of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. God is a subject partner. God has lost His partners of love because He lost the fruits of absolute faith, the fruits of absolute love, and the fruits of absolute obedience. That is, He lost the family of Adam and Eve with their sons and daughters. No force can prevent you from grasping Reverend Moon's spell like this. For such victors of unification, all creation says Amen, while cheering Manse. When God created the universe, He did so on a basis of absolute faith. Thus, whether God has said will absolutely be fulfilled. There is nothing that cannot be accomplished. Also, the purpose of creation is to have object partners of love, absolute love. There is no room for doubt, no second thoughts. Next is absolute obedience. Absolute obedience means not having a sense of self. Even God is no exception to this.
God started creating all things based on absolute faith. He began to create so that He could have object partners of absolute love. Absolute obedience means that there exists no awareness of self. It is a state of complete zero, a complete nothingness. Once God returns to nothingness, a circular movement automatically begins. Since everything is given out and there's no more to give, God returns to the bottom. This has become the origin of the movement of the universe. Thus, after completely investing everything, things go down preparing to go up once more. At the time of creation, God created based on absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. This total giving left a complete vacuum, resulting in a depletion in which not even the tiniest particle remained between the two sides, which then attach to each other and become one. This is how oneness, total oneness, is achieved. When oneness is created and fullness is produced, like a type of high-pressure zone, then a circular motion is created. Likewise, if you totally invest yourself from the position of absolute nothingness, a dynamic type of movement can occur. When I apply such a principle and invest myself for the universe based on the absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, there will come a time when the world naturally unites and the high pressure zone will be completely filled. Here it is logical that the unification of the world will naturally appear without conflict. God raised Adam and Eve, wanting them to be absolutely faithful. God wanted the family of Adam and Eve to stand in absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience because the place of love for the ideal world that He had created with absolute faith was to be a place of such standard. But Adam and Eve fell. They destroyed the standard of absolute faith, violated the standard of absolute love, and abandoned the standard of absolute obedience. Where can such people go? They are bound to go to hell. The commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve was to do with love, which is symbolized by the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They should have become one in the love of God, who had practiced absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. However, they lost that position, and Reverend Moon has come today and is speaking about this to restore it. It is amazing that a system of truth has been established which people can accept as common sense on a theoretical basis and which can work to reshape their lives. You should understand that you are standing in a position of kings and queens and rich men and women, which is more precious than that of billionaires and the presidents of all nations.
God created with absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, and aspired towards the ideal unified world of absolute love. God Himself practiced all these: absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Thus, we should also inevitably practice them in order to earn the right to be partners with God. Even if we may go to a place of death, or even if we may lose our life, we should still stand on a standard of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Only then can we, as His sons and daughters, resemble the image of the Father who has passed through history, investing and forgetting about His investment in order to find absolute love. That is why Jesus came to this earth and said, as a motto for going to the heavenly kingdom, whoever seeks to gain his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will preserve it. We are trying to regain what was lost in Adam's family: absolute faith, absolute love. What is obedient? What is absolute love? God's purpose of creation is to find partners of love. In order to find the absolute partners of love, God Himself has been investing absolute love as the standard. Thus, absolute obedience means that even your own way of thinking should not exist. You invest your whole self and forget about what you've invested. God does not acknowledge His own value as the creator of heaven and earth. He lowers Himself. Since God totally invests Himself while going down to the bottom, while His partner is going up to the extent in which he goes even higher than God's position, then they both automatically resurrect.
We should love God. We should have absolute faith in God. With absolute faith, we should love God absolutely and obey Him absolutely. Why? It is in order to receive God's love and to inherit the right of ownership. God created heaven and earth with absolute faith and absolute love and in the position of absolute obedience. God's ideal of creation should possess the standard of absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Adam and Eve were the central beings. God's object partners of love. Thus, because creation was created with absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, these become the standards for existence. Christianity also teaches faith, hope, and love. What is the greatest among them all? It is love. It is exactly the same. God created all things with absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. It requires you to have no sense of self. It requires that you be conscious of others. Hope does not refer to the present time. Instead, it is referring to the future expectations connected to the object partners. Hope is the same for both. It is absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Everything is realized within this realm. God Himself created His partners of love with absolute faith. He created them after proclaiming, I have this faith. He completely invested Himself with absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Absolute faith stands on the basis of absolute love, and absolute obedience stands on the basis of absolute love. This is the main idea of the spirit world. It is the main thought of the eternal spirit world. It is also the main thought of the earth. It is the main thought in both worlds, the kingdom of heaven on earth and the kingdom of heaven in heaven. So you should have such a concept. As long as you have this concept, you can pass anywhere. You can pass everywhere. Just as God created all things with full authority, investing absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, you should also stand in the same position. You should not fail to become object partners to the subject partner in the ideal realm created by God and unite with Him as one. What you should know is that I, Reverend Moon, absolutely believe in the entire contents of the principle. That is what you should understand. That is something which you must absolutely love. There is nothing else. Even if I may have to abandon my world, abandon my family, abandon my wife, and abandon my children, I love the principle absolutely more than them. I absolutely obey it. I invest my present life as well as the entire length of my life in it. I invest everything and then forget it. Until now, you may have understood absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, but it is not a concept. It is something that you must actually put into practice.
You should know that God is liberated with the liberation of humankind, for the liberation of your families. I, Reverend Moon, console God's sorrow of having lost his family. By liberating my tribe, I console God's sorrow of having lost his tribe, and by building a nation. I should liberate God from the sorrow of having lost his nation. What I am trying to do in my life is to regain the lost cosmos in order to console God's sorrow. I do not have my own wish, nor do I have my own thoughts. I just practice absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. If I am told to die, I don't hesitate to die. I try not to avoid something even if I may have to die. Within the bag of the harmony of love, there is a world of peace and unity. You Unification Church members have no way of denying it. This is because even if you study it for 10,000 years, you will not have studied it more than I have. So, if you come to this conclusion clearly and practice it with the absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, everything is completed. Ladies and gentlemen, when you are married, you ask your spouse, "You absolutely trust me, don't you?" If your bride asks you on the first night of your marriage, "How much do you love me?" you would answer, "I love you absolutely, with my mind and body as one. I absolutely love you with the oneness of my mind and body. I absolutely trust you," right? The philosophy of the true parents is simple. It is centered on absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. It is absolute faith centered on love. The absolute faith, however, is a concept, whereas love is the center of everything. Love is invisible, although you experience it. Next, obedience means practice. If we are going to realize love, centered on love, we must obey. The purpose of obedience is to achieve something greater. So to achieve this, we should invest ourselves. If this grows centering on ourselves, it cannot fully grow. God's tradition of infinite love expands everywhere continuously. The issue is the relationship between husband and wife. That is why my first declaration in Jardim was absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Through this, we are returning to the original position of God at the time of creation. The realm of dominion based on accomplishments, or the realm of direct dominion through the fulfillment of humankind's personal responsibility. All these refer to the accomplishment of our responsibility. By receiving the blessing centering on love, this is the view of the principle, isn't it? When you stand with this view, you should completely resemble God to your mind and body. God created all things based on absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Therefore, unless the human beings, Adam and Eve, become one true absolute faith and stand in a position of object partners to Him through absolute love and absolute obedience, there will never be a way for them to become one with Him. At their one meeting point, they can reach the standard of oneness. This point should not be off even one iota. This is logical. This is a serious matter.
The fall means having failed to have absolute faith. You should know this. It is absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. God emphasized this. Why? It was so that He could bequeath to you the entire ideal of love. In order for you to do so, you should resemble Him. Absoluteness implies that there is only one. This is a road that leads to one, not two. How do we connect ourselves to that single path? We can connect by living for the sake of others. God also created with such a concept. It is absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Even God has no other concept. It means none, a zero. When God created Adam and Eve, He had absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience. Because God created in this way, His partners must stand on absolute faith and be in the position of absolute obedience. Otherwise, they cannot enter the realm of God's love. This is where the kingdom of heaven and hell are divided. This is the content of the commandment. Americans, being individualists, are saying, "I am the best. And who is this Reverend Moon? He's just the founder of Unification Church. So what? He has nothing to do with me. When Reverend Moon talks about absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience, they are saying, what kind of words are these? Are they words from a dictator or a king? The dictator or king is God. He is, however, the true dictator or king. The false dictator or king is Satan. You should know this. If you tell God not to act as the owner, would he stop acting as the owner? The answer is eternally no.